the Bill Gates tunnel in Washington State, the highway that led in front of it would have cut into the Gates property. And so they rerouted. So they paid the state to have the highway rerouted so that Gates could maintain his privacy. To me, that was an example of like how people do live by different rules, can get a lot done that the rest of us can't.
Welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. Who is the real Bill Gates? Anyuprita Das focuses on that question in her new book, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. Das is the South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. She speaks on this episode with guest host Ross Reynolds, the longtime interviewer and public radio host from the Seattle region. Here's Ross.
Why did you decide to write this book?
You know, back in 2021, when Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates got divorced, I got pulled into the reporting because I had written about Gates's fortune going back to 2014. And the question of what was going to happen to that money became pertinent because of the Gates Foundation. And so, you know, leading up to that divorce, there was this period where you had Jeffrey Epstein, you know, the convicted sex offender, and Gates's connections. And so leading up to that moment, I was like, who is this person? You know, I at least had thought of him as the Microsoft co-founder and this global philanthropist. And beyond that, wasn't really paying that much attention. So that for me was the aha moment to try to explore who this persona was and who the person was. And what does it say about sort of how we engage with billionaires?
Did you get to interview Bill Gates?
No, he turned down my requests for an interview.
Were you surprised?
I wouldn't say I was. I mean, for two reasons. I think they can be a combative bunch, and I think they've had to be so since 2019, especially because of the Epstein stuff. So I wasn't surprised.
Now, some people shut down not only their own communication, but tell all their friends not to talk to people who are writing about them. Did you experience that level of shutout?
Without going into too much detail, I think there are always going to be some people who wouldn't talk about Gates, who are friends of his and who are close to him in other ways. At the same time, you do talk to people who have worked with him in many contexts and who have had personal experience with him in different settings. And so you get a really good view into who this person is in interactions on daily life, you know, in his interactions with Melinda or Warren Buffett. So it was a mix of kind of talking to a lot of people in his orbit, some closer and some who were kind of like in the Microsoft realm, for instance, or the foundation.
Now, the book covers his entire life. I'm not going to talk about his early life because that's been covered elsewhere. And also we have a limited amount of time. I could speak to you for some hours on this. But I'd like to jump to, you mentioned the Jeffrey Epstein connection, and you spent quite a few pages describing that. They met a number of times after Epstein had been convicted as a sexual predator. And Gates has consistently said, I was just trying to get into my orbit to help out with the work of my foundation. He said it was a failure of judgment on my part. So what are your thoughts on what you learned and what still remains to be unknown about the Bill Gates-Epstein connection?
From everything I was able to report, it was more in-depth than had been reported previously in terms of what exactly Epstein was trying to do. The fact that he was pitching to Bill Gates that he had a way to raise money from other billionaires to create this big fund for polio. And polio eradication was a big focus of Gates at that time and still is. The question, though, is why, if you're one of the world's most famous billionaires, would you need the help, the assist of someone like Epstein? So that remains a mystery. And as you mentioned, Gates has always talked about how it was a lapse in judgment. The second piece of it that's confusing to me is there are a lot of people around Gates. Did they not advise him? And I think I wrote this in the book that even a simple Google search would tell you that, Epstein was kind of a shady character. So that piece of it has never been entirely clear. And the third is, I think it's basically Gates and Epstein. One of them is dead, and Gates, beyond what he has said, unless he comes forth and kind of lays it out more clearly, we will never know. And so far, what he has said publicly has been limited to it's a discussion about philanthropy. And once Gates realized that there was no money actually coming, then he cut off those ties.
So we'll have to stay tuned to find out if any more information comes out about this. Bill Gates was notoriously a hard-charging, brusque personality at the Microsoft company. How do you think that affected the company, and do you think it's had a lingering effect on Microsoft?
I think Microsoft at that time, there were many factors. In the 80s. It was okay almost, not just at Microsoft, but many other companies in corporate America, to have this very hard charging culture, right? You didn't have HR departments in a lot of companies until the 90s. You didn't even think that was necessary. At Microsoft, almost, a lot of people I talked to said the company took on the personality of its co-founder, in the sense that it was very competitive. It was very sort of, no holds barred. You have to go, go, go. And you were rewarded for that individual kind of competitive behavior. And a lot of people looked up to Gates and tried to emulate that behavior. So if you are kind of a more collegial, collaborative person, Microsoft might not have been the best, place for you to work at. At the same time, if you're a certain kind of very aggressive person, you thrive on that competition. There are teams pitted against each other to kind of come up with the best product. And some of that definitely does continue at Microsoft. But I think one of the big things under Satya Nadella is that, at least publicly, he has definitely tried to alter that image. And I don't think that was the case as much under Ballmer either. And so, definitely to kind of put this kinder, gentler spin on Microsoft, to have more processes in place. At the same time, you have had complaints of sexual harassment and gender discrimination as recently as 2015.
In your book, you place Bill Gates in the context of billionaires, and a lot of what you're writing is about the myths we have about billionaires. And one is that they're self-made. They've created these tech revolutions and powerful companies and made billions of dollars coming from nothing virtually. And even Bill Gates' father, Bill Gates Sr., has famously questioned whether his son could have achieved such heights without the advantages he had at birth. What does the myth of the self-made billionaire leave out, and particularly in Bill Gates' case?
I think a number of things. Firstly, the truth of it is more complicated and messier. When we think about self-made, you have to think about what is the point at which someone starts. Of course, in a sense, they are self-made, right? They created these companies, where you look at Michael Dell or Gates, but they came at it with privileges that I think helped. And one of the things is that if you think about 1955, you think about when Gates was born, and if you think about the 60s, where a personal computer existed, but it wasn't something that existed in people's homes at all, not for another 2 decades, but was there in university labs. And Gates, living in this kind of sheltered world. His mom was on the board of the University of Washington. His dad was one of the best known lawyers, and they were both community leaders. So you had this level of access into what was the latest at that time. And I think to be in a stable setting, to have access to the most advanced technologies, you have to be brilliant, but it allows you to start at kind of a level well ahead of many other people. And then I think, the lack of downside risk is something that really struck me, in the sense that, you went into Harvard, you got to Harvard, and you would have had a great career if Microsoft had failed, right? So that kind of security perhaps allows you to take much bigger risks. And it was similar to with Mark Zuckerberg as well, with Michael Dell as well, that they came from a certain background, upper middle class existence. That's not necessarily true of everyone else who became a billionaire, but I think that piece of it needs to be recognized when we think about the idea of self-made. And the second point I'll make quickly is that a lot of the tech was kind of researched and subsidized by the government, right? DARPA, when you think of GPS, when you think of the internet. So not to take away from what people have done and created, it's amazing. They've changed our world, but there is a lot that has gone into it, subsidies, research funds that you have to take into account when you think about self-made.
There was a lot written about how hard driving Bill Gates was and how harsh he was. When he left Microsoft and became a full-time philanthropist, all of a sudden that began to shift. And that was not by accident. There was a great deal of expensive effort that went into changing his public image. And how is Bill Gates viewed in public opinion polls today compared to when he was the swashbuckling leader at Microsoft?
I mean, largely, I mean, he is, until the Epstein stuff, I mean, for years he was seen as he was the most admired man in the world. I mean, that such was his renown, right? Also, the highly visible nature of Gates's philanthropy. I mean, this is a man who still is a man who gets the same welcome as a head of state, right? He can easily go into any country and seek a meeting, and the prime minister or the president will take that meeting. So that celebrity, that sort of, benevolence in terms of being able to say that you are giving 99% of your wealth to philanthropy. I mean, it's an incredible boost to your persona, to who you are. And it's also a generational change, right? People who knew him in his Microsoft days are not the people who know him primarily as a philanthropist. I mean, there are obviously people who are older, but for an entire generation or two, that's been who he is known as primarily. And so in that guise, I mean, it's very hard to criticize someone like Gates because he is doing good. He is a celebrity. He is highly visible, and that helps him, gives him a purge to advocate, and he has the money to back it up.
And yet we do hear from some people who worked for him at the foundation who say a meeting with Bill Gates is terrifying. I mean, you get the same sense of some of the terror he brought into his employees at the Gates Foundation when he supposedly transformed himself into this benevolent philanthropist. What did you find in that regard?
Absolutely. It struck me as amusing that people at the Gates Foundation describe an environment that was not unlike what people at Microsoft, described to me, in the sense that Gates was, again, just would come into a meeting, no small talk, no preamble, kind of just say, give me the goods. And if you stumbled or if you weren't fully prepared, he could be very harsh toward you. And I think at Microsoft, maybe in the tech world, like a lot of people enjoyed that, or at least not like enjoyed, they kind of understood that. But in a foundation, when you have a lot of people coming from the very genteel worlds of academia or policy, I think that was a rude awakening to be talked to that way, especially because you were hired to the foundation for your expertise. So generally you're at the top of your field, and then to be made to feel like, someone's questioning your expertise, someone's sort of, having this back and forth, but is trying to impose his point of view. And that was difficult for a lot of people to take. And so I think one of the things was either you go along with it, or you kind of quit, or you say, I have a cushy job and I believe in the foundation's work, and I'm just going to stay quiet and continue.
GeekWire did contact Bill Gates' representatives for comment on the book, and they responded with this statement, quote, "Relying almost exclusively on second and third-hand hearsay and anonymous sources, the book includes highly sensationalized allegations and outright falsehoods that ignore the actual documented facts Mr. Gates' office provided to the author on numerous occasions." We did ask Mr. Gates' office to provide us with those same documented facts, and they did not respond to that question. We'll be right back with more from guest host Ross Reynolds, speaking with New York Times journalist Anuprita Das, author of the book Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack about talking with the children and young adults in your life about money. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
Why is it important to talk to children and young adults about their financial goals? I'm Brian Westbrook. In Money Hacks, presented by BECU, we'll talk about what parents can do to help educate their children. And Stacy Black is the lead financial educator for BECU. What tips would you have for parents?
I would say start early, and it's never early enough. The sooner we get started, the more we're going to position our children for bright financial futures. So having those conversations, being open, honest, just talking through everyday spending and finances with our kids is important.
It's important for them to know that just because you can walk up to an ATM, that doesn't mean there's an unlimited supply of cash.
Yep. It's not free money, which I thought it was.
Man, I'm learning a lot. Well, you can learn a lot more on this episode of Money Hacks. Check out geekwire.com/BECU. I'm Brian Westbrook.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the mechanism of the image making around Bill Gates. A week after this podcast drops, he's going to be in his second Netflix docuseries called What's Next? The Future with Bill Gates. He is partnering with Netflix on that. And it seems as though that's quite a different relationship from talking to a journalist. I wonder if you could talk about the way he's able to exert himself with those billions of dollars and that attitude on influencing public opinion.
Yeah, I think the rise of social media definitely gave Gates and a lot of other influencers a direct way to talk to their fans and to the audience, right? There was no mediation, no media to kind of filter or kind of write a truer and more balanced account. So, you can pitch yourself as you want. And so if you look at his blog, right, if you look at Gates Notes, where he writes about these, everything that he does in a very engaging, accessible way, he kind of became the billionaire book critic because every year he'd put out his recommended reading. And then he has like Instagram, he has X, he has a presence, and this kind of like grandfather, nerdy, tech, lovable philanthropist, Bill, which has emerged as a sustained kind of, because of the sustained effort, right? Like, this is how we want to communicate who Bill is, and we're going to do that. We can do that. And so I think the Netflix documentary is the one that's inside Bill's brain, which, a lot of people found very flattering to him. Again, these things, are not in absolutes, but he's also writing his three-part memoir, right? The first one, I think, is coming out in February, which deals with his pre-Microsoft days. And I think the second would be Microsoft days, and the third would be, I guess, as a philanthropist. And so I do think that there's a lot of work that goes into sustaining this kind of image as we have seen in the past 20 years.
I mean, you put his wealth at $124 billion, I believe. Is he worth less than he was worth when he started supposedly giving away all his money?
This is the nature of the stock market and wealth. I mean, I think this is the odd thing, of one of the things. I couldn't think of a better way to put it than it's like trying to climb down an up escalator, right? You're trying to give your money away. You're saying that you're trying to give your money away, yet it's invested in all of these ways that actually the benefits of which accrue to you. And you could argue that the more money he has, the more there is to give away. But at the same time, giving that money away wisely is very challenging. And so it's this weird conundrum where you have a lot of money, you say you're going to give it away, but at the same time, you don't quite know how to give it away. And the more you give, the more money seems to be coming in. And this is not true just of Gates. If you look at sort of the rise in billionaire wealth, it is incredible to me to see just how much wealth has risen. Same thing with Warren Buffett, right? Like, you've committed to give all this money away, but you've only reached the midpoint recently of how much money he plans to give away. He's 93. And so there's $100+ billion left.
It just seems to be making more money than he's giving away. And as you say, there's a lot of reasons for that.
Right, exactly.
So I'd like to focus on his work as a philanthropist through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, now the Gates Foundation. And how does the annual giving by the Gates Foundation and its influence in the charitable areas it chooses to inhabit compare to other foundations, and also, for that matter, to governments, to the United Nations?
Yeah, I think the Gates Foundation institutionalized a certain kind of philanthropy, what I call big philanthropy. If you think about traditional philanthropy, even from very wealthy people, it was about writing a check, endowing a chair, giving money to a hospital or a museum or something like that. But for Gates and the Gates Foundation, it was a very data-driven approach where they picked and chose what they wanted to focus on, whether it's polio or TB or malaria, because Gates was very big on public health as an area that he wanted to kind of go into and fix, quote unquote. And so a lot of that was metrics based. So you pick something, a vertical, say, you identify which nonprofits you want to give that money to on the ground. And then you give the money, but you hold them to certain standards. And then, there are metrics and there's assessments. So I do think that if you're a nonprofit on the ground, you risk spending a lot of time kind of providing these metrics and data points to assess the program's success, because it's tied to the foundation's money, right? Whereas I think that's quite different. The level of kind of engagement is unusual. You could look at Bloomberg, Mike Bloomberg's philanthropies, right? Again, it is similar in the sense that they give away a lot of money, but it's not as kind of, it doesn't have such a tight grip on what the money is being put to use for. So the Gates Foundation is quite unique in that sense.
You're right that it's difficult to decide the impact of the Gates Foundation influence around the world, particularly on their big areas of interest, which are global health and development. Why is it hard to figure out what they've accomplished after they spent all this money?
It depends on what you consider impact. Of course, they claim, and it's true, and a lot of numbers have come down. Polio, for instance, has been nearly eradicated, but virus isn't nearly eradicated. Either it's gone or it's not. And it's not just something the Gates Foundation worked on. It was one of the partners to this effort that's been going on for decades. And so there has been impact in that you've reached, say, a country like India, for instance, has been declared free of wild polio. And so that is due to the work of a lot of organizations and governments, of which the Gates Foundation is one. So there is a measurable impact. But when you think about things like a life is saved because I provided a vaccine or there was an intervention, what happens to that, say, child 5 years on, right? So you could say the mortality rate has decreased. And then, but when you track that child over a lifetime, I mean, did the quality of life improve? Were there educational opportunities? So I think where and how you assess impact can be more nuanced than simply kind of looking at data and saying, okay, we've done this and let's move on.
You mentioned that the number that they constantly put out is number of lives saved, and you say that's kind of unusual in that world of philanthropic help and public health around the world. Why is it different than what most organizations use, and what does that mean that it's different?
There are more. There are drier ways, like in the language of economics, and and like if you're looking at WHO or UN, sometimes they will use lives saved. But to me, it was more almost of a personal assessment of the idea that I've gone in and I've saved a life. It's almost religious in a way, the way I thought of it. But that is the language they use, and I think it might have an impact. If you're hearing that, you might get the sense that the foundation's doing so much more than kind of what is doing technically, and it kind of adds to the the halo of someone like a Gates, right? When you're saying, "Oh, I've saved lives," I've gone in, I'm the savior, and I'm this person who has, with my money, just uplifted like an entire society. Whereas, the under 5 mortality rate has changed, or a more technical term.
We'll be right back with more from guest host Ross Reynolds and New York Times journalist Anuprita Das, author of the book Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King.
You've got a chapter called Why We Hate Billionaires. And I'm wondering, do we really hate billionaires? We've seen Gates being lauded as one of the most people thought to be most useful to the world. Why do you think we really hate billionaires despite these things?
People who get upset about billionaires and billionaire wealth, I think they would generally say that it's this unaccountability, it's this extreme wealth that goes beyond yachts and houses. It goes, it extends to influence in ways that we don't always recognize. It's one thing for someone to have a meeting with a, head of state, but it's quite another for them to be directing policy, whether, it's by giving money to charter schools or it's by influencing public health, right? If you're one of the Gates Foundation, say, is one of the biggest donors to the WHO, its budget exceeds that of like many countries. And so the level of influence may not always be obvious. And I think that is something that requires scrutiny. And I think people who see that and understand that, or the Koch brothers, right, or Harlan Crow, are shocked by it. And I think that's when you begin to think, okay, like, who are these people and why do we revere them so much? And like, how much influence have we given them? And should we think about that? And so I think that angers a lot of people. And I will say, at the same time that like you have seen kind of this widening inequality, right, since the late 70s. And so if you look at the graph, you can see kind of like there's just this spread. And so if you look at data like that, you kind of think how many advantages have billionaires had that kind of, put them there. So, that can lead to questioning and perhaps hate for some. The Bill Gates tunnel in Washington State.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a great local example that people listening to this in the local area may not know about. Could you talk about that story?
Yeah, so in Hood Canal, right, where the Gates family vacation compound has long been, and Gates and Jeff Rakes, former Microsoft executive, very close friend of Gates, and also the owner, also the former CEO of the Gates Foundation, and the owner of a resort and spa called Alderbrook, which borders the Gates family compound. And so when Alderbrook reopened after a renovation, after Rakes bought it and they renovated, reopened it. The way it was set up would have basically cut into the Gates property. The highway that like led in front of it would have cut into the Gates property. And so they rerouted. So they paid the state to have the highway rerouted so that Gates could maintain his privacy. Now, Washington State has, allows for these private-public partnerships, but at the same time, I don't think even if you and I mean, at least me, had $2.5 million that I could just like call up the state and say, hey, can you send people to build me a separate tunnel? And I went there, and it's really interesting because you see it's like this wood and wrought iron gate, and then you kind of like you have to be looking for it. It's this winding path and that then goes under the highway and goes into the other side. So it's fun too. And so to me, that was an example of like how people do live by different rules, can get a lot done that the rest of us can't.
Bill Gates is this optimist who believes that by applying knowledge and data, we can conquer the world's most pressing problems like climate change and inequality. But in your conclusion, you write, quote, any optimist will tell you that history is not a reason to give up on the future, but money, ambition, and optimism are modest beacons that can only guide us so far through the unmapped caverns of a troublesome world. If are there other beacons that we should be looking at or others are looking at that might guide us through our troublesome world?
I think more of an acknowledgement of, and more of a community, if you will, of people who acknowledge just how big the issues are. That would be the beginnings of a beacon, I think. I don't know that it does exist today, but I do think that if you're Gen Z and younger, you're inheriting a world with so many different problems. So one can only hope that they do become a modest beacon that, guides us further towards sort of what is a more equitable world, what is a world where climate change is actually, there's more being done to combat and limit climate change. So I don't know of any beacons, but I tend to be a pessimist as a journalist.
That's a
That's
problem of the trade.
Exactly.
Well, you didn't get to talk to Bill Gates, but if you had a chance to talk to Bill Gates, what would your first question have been? What would you wanted to know most from him?
Does he agree with the way the world looks at him? I mean, does he have humility about it? Does he have, does it only feed into his notion of self? How self-aware is he of how he is looked at, and how does he use that? Does he put ego aside to do the best he can with the goodwill that he has of the world? I think he would know exactly what the book was going for. And it's interesting to me because The Economist in its review kind of wrote about the influence of billionaires and how I'm trying to address this. And I thought to myself that Gates reads The Economist cover to cover. So he would have read, I assume, their review of my book. And so the question is, does he agree? Does he not? I mean, that might be something worth kind of investigating further.
Anuprita Das is the author of the new book, Billionaire Nerd, Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. She'll be speaking in Seattle on Thursday, September 19th, at Third Place Books in the Ravenna neighborhood, and she spoke on this episode with guest host Ross Reynolds. Curt Milton edited this episode. Our theme music is by Daniel L.K. Caldwell. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back next week with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.